Okay, so finally, so choosing the prototype. So I'm using the 517 project that I did as an example. Yeah, choosing the prototype, it's a difficult one. There's a couple of considerations that have to take into account. First of all, can you get information? There's some prototypes that I would love to have done, for example, the Great Western River class, but we could just never find any works drawings. There's really nothing in existence. The next thing is the quantity, and this is actually one of the biggest factors in choosing a prototype, because the builders in Asia need to make a minimum quantity. We could do thousands of different projects if we only needed to do 30 or 35 models, but that just doesn't work commercially. So you've got that to take into account as well. And sometimes it's really just a sort of gut feeling. I've tried in the past to do surveys of customers and ask, what would people like to see us do? And pretty much everybody came back with a different answer. So that didn't help. When I got going with this, I wanted to do a sort of program of large engines and small engines. So commercially, it would be maybe make more sense, it would seem, to do all the big engines, the Pacifics and this kind of stuff. But not everybody has space or the finance for that kind of model. And so the 517, which is a personal favorite of mine, and that also comes into the choice a little bit as well, seemed to be ideal. The only problem with this particular prototype is pretty much everyone is different. I mean, it really is the Heinz 57 of classes. And so you get to that point and it's really fingers crossed. You put it on your website, you put it out there to customers and see what kind of feedback you get, what kind of interest you get. And this, for any importer or any maker of models, is really important to get feedback from customers if they're genuinely interested, because as soon as you start getting into design and production, you're starting to spend a lot of money. And if it doesn't work out, that can be disastrous, to say the least. So the next thing, once we've chosen the prototype, is to start gathering data. And obviously works drawings are very, very important. With the 517, thankfully, there was a fair amount available. Sometimes with pre-grouping prototypes, a lot of the drawings were destroyed by the railway companies, Swindon, Crewe, etc. Used to actually, I think Crewe one time just took a lot of the drawings out, put them in a skip and set them on fire. And I talked to one chap who was actually diving into the skip and pulling drawings out. And the other thing with the works drawings as well is sometimes you come across a drawing, say at the NRM, and you think, great, and then you find out it doesn't actually match any photographs that you have. An example of that would be when we were doing the Dean Goods project. Malcolm Mitchell and I worked together a lot on all the Great Western projects I've done, and I actually managed to track down individual drawings for the cabs, just for the cabs alone. And in studying these and studying all the photographs, not one of the drawings matched a single photograph. So they made all these lovely drawings, and then in the work, somebody decided, no, I think we'll do it this way instead. And we actually had to figure it out from photographs. And of course, you know, that's a little bit of a waste of money as well when you realize you bought all these drawings for nothing. So this can take some time. It can take a lot of time to find the drawings. Sometimes you're looking at private collections. There's drawings everywhere. Thankfully, these days, the NRM's got a lot of stuff online. They've scanned a lot of stuff. Thanks to societies as well, various railway societies, they've actually gone in and catalogued drawings for the NRM. So that's actually more and more making it a lot easier to find drawings. And they've got, now they tend to have sort of small images online that you can view. as I was saying to James and Peter earlier, I have in the past ordered drawings and spent the money and then found out that it's just a large drawing of a bolt with a bracket and not what I thought it was going to be at all. So the next thing we need to look at is gathering photographs. Later on, if you're doing a BR prototype, you're pretty well spoiled for choice. Obviously, there's lots of pictures taken. Pre-grouping wise, it can be difficult. And especially with a prototype like the 517, Dean Goods is the same. There's so many variants. So you look at these two pictures and thankfully it's the same engine, but over that engine's life, it would have changed. Smoke box would have had rivets, extra rivets and all this kind of thing. So trying to find photographs of a particular engine through its lifespan can be very difficult. On the 517s, for example, things like the wheelbase changed. There was outside bearings on the rear wheels. And as you can see by the picture there, there's always a driver and fireman standing exactly in front of the part you need to see. It never fails. So this side of things, the research side of things, is also an aspect that I really, really enjoy. I love spending hours piling through books and magazines and looking for photographs online. So that can take a long time, and you really have to spend the time at this point, because the builders themselves don't know the prototype, they don't understand the prototype. So it's up to you to supply as much information as possible and make that information as clear as possible. So I have to find out beforehand whether a drawing that we have is actually of any use, or sometimes I've found that I will use part of a drawing rather than the whole thing. So I have to crop the drawing and just give them that one piece of information. So here we can see some varieties in the 517 class, and you know, it's fairly evident there was lots of changes. Now, it's impossible to do that on a production run. You cannot make 100, or in this case, we made 140. You can't make 140 completely individual models. So you have to try and narrow things down a little bit, again, because it's a commercial enterprise. So you have to look at this, and it's up to me to decide what do I think will be popular, what will people want. Hopefully try and get that right each time. So the next stage, once I've got all the information together and I've gone through that and I'll mark up drawings and photographs, that then goes off to the designer in Korea. Some designers work with the builders in-house. Some designers work on their own and work for several different builders. It all depends. This particular design was originally done by a chap called Mr. Shin. And he was just a chap that worked for lots of different builders. And he was a very good designer and a nice guy to work with. So this first stage that we have in the project design is called the GOD, General Overall Design. And so this is their first attempt at taking all that information, the works drawings, photographs, anything else that I can give them. And if I've got books, I'll often buy 2 copies and send them a copy as well, so they have as much as possible. They will then take this information and do this general overall design with the different views. Once this is done, and this is done in before, certainly done in AutoCAD normally. Now a lot of the builders, thankfully, are moving over to 3D, which makes life a lot easier. But this is basically what I would get. So my job now is to look at this. As you can see, I've called this version 2. It covers certain engines that we're doing. And I have to check, is everything correct here? The very first thing you check is the wheelbase. You know, have they got the wheelbase right? If that's wrong, everything else is wrong. And this is a point where you really need the help of somebody else. You can sit and stare at these drawings and eventually your eyes start to swirl in the back of your head. So in this case, Malcolm and I worked together, and we would have many sessions basically on the phone with both of us looking at the same drawing and looking at photographs together. And this can be hours and hours and hours of work. because you're asking a designer who, as I said before, has no idea of the prototype, probably doesn't care that much either, to be honest. But the ability of the designers in Asia to take this information, and normally from the get-go, they're pretty accurate. They're pretty good. They're very, very good at interpreting works drawings and all the other data. After this stage, so I have to go through and I have to look at every version. On this, we had multiple versions on the 517s. We had also sub versions as well, because you would have one engine which everything else was the same except for the smoke box, which was maybe wider or had rivets, or the door was different. And so that becomes a sub version. The reason for this is that when they make these models, and they're kind of making a brass kit, basically, that's how it's done. Everything's from etches. But every single component on a Korean or Chinese made model has a location hole. So for example, if you can see, there's a little jack just above the front wheel, which the early Great Western engines had. Now, sometimes that would change position. So that would mean in the footplate etch, they would have to have holes in a different position. So that actually means a separate footplate etch, or they have to have little half-etch drilling holes underneath and have to change that depending on the prototype. So once we've got past this stage, the next thing they do is they will produce what's called a part drawing. I haven't got that here because it's basically every single component, right down to the springs used in the axle boxes. And it's every single etch part, casting, wheels, everything is there. And so that's called the part drawing. There can be several hundred parts or more in there. All the castings and things, and I have to go through every single one of those drawings and check they're okay. One of the things that they quite like to do is use drawings from previous projects. One of the things I've always liked to do is try and improve the models each time. So I would then go, no, I don't want to use that drawing, because that means that they can use a previous pattern, lost match pattern. I'll make them do it again. Because I want that little bit of extra detail, or somebody's come along and said, actually, this had this, this, and this, and so on. So once the part drawing is checked, and as I say, that's every component, we'll choose a particular version, and that then will become our pilot sample. So this is just a quick example of 3D drawing. So this was from the 9F project, which I did in China. And you can see the difference right away. On the 3D drawing, I can spin this round, I can separate individual components. Also using 3D as well, you can actually make the model run. So you can animate the model, and that allows you to see if there's going to be any issues. So if two parts are actually going to hit each other, the 3D drawing program will actually show this up. So you can see the difference in looking at this, say, compared to looking at a 2D drawing. Instantly, you get a much better feel for what the model is going to look like. So this is a Time Dock 9F, and with all the pipe runs and things, it was just so much easier to work on. So we come to the pilot sample. So we've chosen this inside bearing 517 as the pilot. This is a really important stage, not just for checking the details, but also for making sure that things are going to run. I've always made sure in my pilot samples that they're motorized because we want to test them. I don't want to find out that there's problems when we're in production and things don't run properly. So to be successful at doing this and have good models, you really have to have this process from the very beginning, from the pilot sample all the way through, of continual checking. When I get the pilot sample, I'll check it over and check it against those GOD drawings that we looked at earlier, make sure everything matches. I'll look at the original photographs. I'll look at my data that I sent them to make sure everything's been understood. Because even though I've looked at the 2D drawings that they've sent me, they're still just 2D, they're still flat drawings. And in my mind, I might think they've understood a particular thing, a particular detail, and I'll get the pilot sample and find out, actually, no, they haven't quite understood that. So then I begin the process of corrections. So I'll look at the model, I'll take photographs where I think things are wrong and feed that back to the builder. And that becomes a continual process. At the same time, the model would then go off to Cliff Williams, who's been helping me pretty much from the beginning, and to do the DCC sound side of things. And he'll take the model away and figure out where to put the speaker, where to put the decoder. He'll then fit that up as a sort of temporary setup, basically, and test it. So we're testing the model on DC, we're testing the model on DCC, so we can understand if there's any problems. Are we getting short circuits somewhere, this kind of thing. So we go through all that testing process. Once all the corrections are done, or as much as we can do, and we've tested the model, we've fitted the sound. At the very beginning, when I started, the first project I did was the LMS Jubilee. And back in 2009, DCC was just really starting to grow. And so I offered models in either just DC or DCC, but at least I had the wherewithal to actually fit the models with speakers, etc. So it was very easy to put a decoder in. And I did the same on the Dean Goods, which was my second project. Then after that, I realized that more and more people were moving over to DCC. And so I just fitted all the models with decoders as standard and just put a little simple plug-in if you wanted to just run on DC only. So the customer always had that choice. So from the pilot sample, that then gets shipped back to Korea. So these models do quite some mileage, and the pilot sample can come backwards and forwards a couple of times if need be. The Koreans can then have the pilot sample, and that's important for them. When they go into production, they need to have this model in front of them. It really helps them during production. It also means that the designer can look at how we've installed the DCC, and he can actually draw that up. And for me, it's always been very important. I want to see every single aspect of the project on a drawing. Very early on, I pushed the builders into using cloud sharing. Dropbox was the one that we could both use. And what happened is my great ideas, if they made any changes to AutoCAD drawings or this kind of thing, it would immediately show up on my computer. But what they did is they did all the corrections and things off Dropbox and then forgot to put it back on Dropbox. So I had no idea what was going on. So that took a little bit of time to get that going. But it certainly made the process of changing and corrections easier. So after that, so we've got the pilot sample made, the corrections have all been done, and that can really take some considerable time. Sometimes you find there's just that little nugget of information that's so hard to track down, you know, that can take longer than you think. You know, normally it's in somebody's attic somewhere, and eventually I've been to shows and somebody's come up going, I've got this photograph, and it's just been the one I needed. So then I basically give the okay. This is after all the drawings have been changed, my corrections are done, and we go into production. The way they tend to do production is they'll work on the frames, for example, and when the frames are made, they'll go to the paint shop, they'll work on the bodies, and everything is done in a series of sub-assemblies. And as I say, all the parts are from etchings. The Koreans and Chinese tend not to use half-etched brass, so it always tends to be full thickness, about 18 thou, for example. On my models, I've always asked for pressed rivets. Some companies just use X rivets. Press rivets, obviously, it's much more time consuming for the builder to do. Sometimes they can make jigs, which will press the rivets into tanks and tenders. Sometimes you literally have to sit there and press them. And I've actually done that before in Korea. They saw me looking a bit bored one Sunday and said, would you sit down and do that? So it's a bit mind-numbing, to say the least. So here we can see a series of frames. Those are completed and ready for the paint shop. The sub-assembled bodies without the foot plates here. Also, again, ready for the paint shop. And this goes on. So the frames would go off to the painters, get painted. The bodies would then follow. As the bodies were at the painters, the frames would come back, and the actual assembly, the wheels, motor pickups, all this kind of thing would go ahead as well. So painting, especially with pre-grouping engines, there's a lot of research involved. And as many of you'll know, it can be very, very difficult sometimes to actually see lining on these old photographs. The film at the time just didn't take it up. So there's no guesswork. We produce painting layouts like this, just called a painting layout. This again can take quite some time to produce. Much easier on a BR black engine with no lining. But here on the 517, we had several liveries, and it was really important to get everything down. And I learned this very early on, that you can see in this drawing down near the bottom where the underside view is, there's a little blow up of the lining, because the lining is normally produced by a reverse decal transfer. So normally transfers that we would get.
Looks like Lee's just frozen. Lee, are you okay? Everything just stopped dead. Ah, right, okay.
Okay, yeah.
Yep,
so yeah, good old internet. So here we have the painters busy at work. As you can see, there's not any sort of fabulous specialized equipment, just rather basic airbrush. Sometimes with the chaps having a cigarette sticking out their mouth at the same time, which is always a bit worrying. And as I was just saying there, they use these reverse decal transfers, and here you can see boiler band lining being applied onto the castle. And you know, that's okay, for example, if you're doing 2 or 3, but you can't imagine doing sort of over 100 of these. But once the transfers are done, then obviously the models go back and they're varnished. And they'll then go back to the builder, and things like glazing will be added, etc. And then it's put onto the frames. After all this assembly is done, and I will have visited a few times during the production of the models, it's really, really important to go out there. Little mistakes can be made. It can be made in by the builder, it can be made by the painter. So it's really important. So with the castles, for example, I went out there and I reviewed everything when it was just in the green and black paint without the lining, and then again, constantly checking what we're doing. After that, when we've got to the stage of full assembly, we've got our completed models. It's then my job again to go out and check every single model, make sure everything's okay. And normally by this stage, because you've been checking the entire time, there shouldn't be any real big problems, certainly hope not. But sometimes you can find that maybe a little bit of lining is missed or something like that. So you've got to check it all. And then the models are packed, they're shipped to the UK. Then again, we take them out and we test run them. Sometimes during shipping, there's a lot of vibration on the aircraft. So sometimes maybe screws can come loose or something. So you need to actually physically check every single model before it's shipped to the customer. Then it's about getting the models out to the customers, and I can finally relax and then start with the next project. So there we go. So that's the basic process. Sure.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Lee. That's a great introduction to how you go about the process. I think we do have some questions, Peter.
Sure.
Yes, I've got a question from Nicholas Bennett, and he'd like to know how the wheels are made.
So the wheels, the center of the wheels are coined brass, so basically stamped with a die. And the insulation tends to be, it's a form of paper they use, and the tires on the wheels are always stainless steel, and these are bonded on. So the wheels are always brass centered. Now there's a little bit of a move, especially in China, to use die cast centers. This is actually really nice, and on the 9F we use this because it allows the correct profile of the spoke from front to back. Obviously, with any kind of sort of die process, there has to be a relief angle, so the spokes are sort of this shape, just the same as you would get with, say, the old AGH cast iron wheels. But now, as I say, there is a big move to die cast centers. They've always used it's a free machining stainless for the tires and also for the axles as well, which are metric 5mm metric axles. I'm not sure why they haven't used steel, maybe just rust. There's a lot of humidity in Asia, so maybe it was too much hassle. They just rusted all the time. So that's the basic process for the wheels.
Okay, I've got another question for you, Lee. Ian McCormack would like you to explain the reverse decals again.
Yeah, sure. So as I say, normally when you get decals here in the UK, you slide the decal off and you put it onto the model, and there's a little bit of backing film there, basically, which stays there. For example, in Fox transfers, it's very, very fine and pretty much disappears during the varnishing process. The Korean version is they screen print. So what happens making the decals, this is where the painting layout is really important, because they take that information from the AutoCAD painting layout into their own computer, and they will actually design all the lining on computer. They'll then make screens and actually old-fashioned screen printing. But the difference is what actually happens, it's just the paint that goes onto the model. So they slide the decal off its main backing sheet, put it on, they apply heat, normally with a sort of heat gun or hairdryer. That actually bonds the paint onto the body, onto the actual model itself. They leave it for a little while, and then they apply some water and just slide the paper off, and all you're left with is just the paint. That's it. Try getting that out of them. Actually, any of the decal papers. Yeah, that's pretty difficult, but that's why the lining tends to be really, really nice on these Asian models. Is because that's all you've got is literally just the paint. Sometimes there is hand lining done as well. On the coaches that I did, it just wasn't possible for them to do decals on all of it. So the bow elections around the windows, there's actually a chap sat there with a bow pen and just sat and lined all those out as well. So sometimes handwork has to be done that way.
Well, thank you, Lee. I've got a question, and that's, you were talking about checking the drawings that you get from your Korean draftsman.
Yeah.
Are you able to import that into a CAD package in, that you use, and then check all the individual items like sizes, radii?
Yeah, I mean, I had to get AutoCAD pretty much from the get-go. And over a period of time, I would sit down with the builder in Korea and the designer and actually learn a little bit about AutoCAD. And eventually I did a proper course here in the UK. And that made life a lot easier because I was actually able to make changes trying to have changes made on a Skype meeting where you're basically yelling at the designer, no, down, further down on the drawing. Yeah, frustrating to say the least. So I could actually get more work done in a couple of days in Korea, sitting down with the designer, since I could actually point at the screen and say, no, that part there I want changed.
Yeah.
With the 3D side of things, I initially started off with just a free viewer, which just allowed me to move things around. In Asia, they tend to use Pro E as a 3D drawing program, which I just could never get my head around at all. So I've started to learn Fusion 360 as a 3D drawing package. And the new builder that I have is able to send me the 3D drawings, and it's just fantastic that I can spin the whole thing around. I can isolate individual components. It's just a lot easier to see what they're intending to make. It's a lot easier for them as well. So it speeds the entire process, the design process up. Yeah.
The designer you use, is that designer also designed for people like Bachmann and other manufacturers?
No, it's in Korea. Really, you had two big companies in Korea in the early days, because the brass stuff all originally started in Japan. This was just immediately post-war. The American GIs being a bit homesick, asked the Japanese artisans if they could make models of, diesel engines, steam engines, and over time, I mean, the Japanese builders are absolutely superb craftsmen. But in time, life just got too expensive in Japan. It moved to Korea, and I think the first couple of years or so in Korea, things were not that good. But eventually, they upped their game quite a bit. So you had Ajin and Samhongsa. Samhongsa, I think, was one of the biggest ones. And so a lot of the small companies, there was up until the pandemic, about 25 to 30 builders in Korea.
Wow.
As I say, many had, like my designer, Mr. Lee, which is very handy, having the same name, which I've always been referred to in Asia as Mr. Lee, because Marsh is not the easiest name to say, so they just called me Mr. Lee. But I worked with the same guy for a long time, so I got to know his mind, and he got to know mine. And originally, the way that design would be done, especially when you're talking about the running side of things, the chassis and frames, is everything would be quite sort of sloppy. If you look at some of the early models from the sort of 70s and 80s, it's all sort of quite sloppy. And I came in and said, I much prefer to start off with the standards a lot tighter, the tolerance is a lot tighter. And then once we get the pilot sample, we can find out what we need to change. Just in the same way, if you're building a kit, you build it and find you maybe have to file this bit or file that bit to get it to run. So it's been really good to work with the same guy. I have used subcontractors a couple of times. It was different builders when I worked in China on the 9F. And that every time you start with a new designer, again, that can be a bit of a long process until they understand what you want, because every importer wants a different thing. I'm very sort of detail focused, and have, being a model maker myself, I maybe have a slightly different approach from different people. But there's quite a few times the designer and I have had more than one argument. I've been sort of banging my finger on the table. No, I want it done this way. And, they don't want to do it that way because it'll make the production a bit harder and a bit longer. But that's just part of the behind the scenes process that you get.
Lee, I've got two questions from Chris Ward. He would like to know on average, how many times do you visit a project? And the other question is, what is your background? Were you involved in engineering in the UK?
Well, I start off with the second part of the question. I've been a model maker now for 27 years. I did have a small amount of engineering training when I left school. In fact, the first job I had, I went to work for RGH. Used to make the diesel kits down in Poole in Dorset. I worked for Ronnie Hoare, and Then I did some engineering training, and then I became an electrician, which is, if I was sensible, I would have stayed at and made a lot more money. But I've always wanted to work in model trains. It's been a sort of dream job really since I guess I was my son's age, and so having that background in model making really helped me understand and be able to work with the builders and the designers, because when they would explain to me an issue, I would have a good understanding of why, you know, if we do it this way, we're going to get a short circuit, or this is going to be impossible to assemble when it's painted. So that really helped. And my background in the ready to run side of things actually started with Michael Brooks. Malcolm Mitchell and I both helped Michael with the research of his first project, which was a castle. I then moved on to working with some Japanese colleagues, which is why the business was originally called SETI Models. It was a Japanese company. And then with the backing of Kevin Wilson from Bucks Hill, I started under my own name, and decided to use my own name, the sort of Harry Truman thing. It's not so much the buck stops here, but the train stops here. So ultimately, you can point the finger at me because my name's on the box. So that's really the sort of background to it. Detail-wise, I've always been obsessed with really nice models with Beeson, and Tony Reynolds is a great influence and a very good friend. And I wanted to try and do something like that in Ready to Run, and just do my own thing, do things my own way, which I've tried to do. And you know, I'm proud of what we produced, but it's a lot of collaboration. I mean, I've had help from a lot of people. Bob Meanley at Tysley has been a tremendous help over the years, not just for prototype information, but for looking at the models and seeing what could be changed, what could be bettered. And as I say, Cliff Williams has been at my side with the DCC side of things, because there's only so much you can do. It's a one-man business, and you know, I think I had somebody asking me one time if I could get one of my staff, and I said, well, I'm not Amazon, it's just me. So, on my own. So that's kind of the background. So I had a tiny little bit of engineering background, but actually my trade is as an electrician, industrial side mostly.
Where do the sound projects come from? I mean, is there a 517 around?
No, not without a time machine. And I would dearly love a time machine so I could go back and see what the actual colours of engines are.
Oh, wouldn't that be great?
That would be the main thing.
The trouble is you go back and you'd have a look at the engine, it'll be 10 years after it was painted. It's a completely different colour from when it started.
Yeah, sorry, I forgot your question, James. Say again.
So have I. Hang on a minute. Oh, sound projects. Where do they?
Oh yeah. So Brian Robertson has basically done all of them. So sometimes with things like a 517, well, what do you do? There are no 517s. I think the last were gone in the mid-40s. So you look at the engine that came after it, which is the 14XX, and you can get a sound recording of that. It's very, very similar. It's two-cylinder. It has a tall chimney. It's pretty much the engine that came after the 517. And so you can use that. But sometimes in sound, you have to mix things. And a lot of it is really down to, you listen to the model and does that sound right? You can have a fantastic recording. And because I think the problem we have, particularly in Steam, is trying to fit big enough speakers, or speakers that give enough of the bass notes, can be really, really hard. So Brian spends a lot of time playing around. When we are at the pilot sample stage, that's when we'll try the sound out, and I'll listen to it and decide whether, you know, this sound needs to come up or down. And for example, in a Great Western engine, you have the vacuum pump. And so when the engine's coasting, that's still ticking away the whole time. And you want people to be able to hear that. You don't want, for example, the sound of shoveling to be so loud that you can't hear, shoveling coal to be so loud you can't hear anything else. So there's a lot of toing and froing. Cliff's side of things is basically putting that all together. I think on the Jubilee we used started to use a sound cam, and I found that because of the suspension and things, it just wasn't always reliable. So the decoders that were coming in, I think that was the ESU 3.5 XL, is you could synchronize. So poor Cliff has to sit there and spend hours and basically synchronize the chuffs according to the revolution of the wheels. And there's a little bit playing around with that has to be done with the synchronization when the engine's moving slowly compared to when it's moving quickly. So yeah, so there's a lot of work. Again, it just would be impossible for me to do all that on my own. So again, every importer needs help, basically. Yeah.
So is that done, the synchronization, is that done on each model differently?
Well, I mean, it basically, as long as each project it's done on.
Okay.
So we basically, at that pilot sample stage, that's when we'll figure out all these parameters for the DCC sound settings. Okay. And that's why sometimes when people like to play around with the settings, as I've discovered as well, if you alter one setting, it knocks something else off. It all goes pear-shaped on you. So I just leave it up to Cliff. As long as I'm happy with the running and the sound, that's it. And as I say, we just found it much more reliable than any kind of cam. Although you can get magnetic cams and things as well, it's also additional wiring that if you use synchronization through the decoder, you don't need a cam. You don't need the wiring that comes with the cam as well. So we dispensed with that quite a long time ago.
And a lot of your locos, I mean, I'm quite interested in the way the chassis is designed and put together. You're using plunger pickups. Are they the same right the way through your range? Are the motors and gearboxes the same right the way through?
And also every gearbox is custom designed for the project. And the original gearboxes tended to be wire cut brass. So always enclosed. They were never open frame gearboxes. But they were wire cut, and then I think it was with the 517 that I wanted to move over to CNC milled brass gearboxes. And I explained to them one of the problems I had with the older gearboxes is that the lining up of the two side plates was only done with screws, and whenever you do that, you can have a little bit off. And sometimes you had to play around with the gearboxes to get them to run really smoothly. With a CNC machine gearbox, and one of the things I asked them to do on that and explain to them is I also wanted location spigots. So as the two halves of the box are joined, there's actually steel location pins, like you would get in a car gearbox, basically, which is how I explained it to them. And that just gives you a perfect lineup. So the shafts for the gears are all perfectly parallel to each other. Motors wise, I've mostly used Fallhaber, Swiss Fallhaber coreless motors over the years. I've actually been to the factory in Switzerland to visit them. I think on the 61 and some of the smaller engines, I actually had motors custom made for me in Japan by Citizen, the watch company. They also have a micro motor division, and so they made motors but with extended shafts for the gears. A lot of off-the-shelf motors come with a very small shaft because they're not made for model trains, basically. So yeah, so it's been a mixture of Citizen and mainly Fallhaber.
Mm-hmm. Do you have to keep spares for just in case things go wrong? Is that something that your business?
Yeah. I mean, these things are all custom done. If you contact Fallhaber, they don't have anything off the shelf. Everything is made for you, and so you always have a couple of spares. But companies like Fallhaber, if you have an issue with one of their motors, if there's a fault, they're very, very good at fixing that. And actually, over all these models, I've never ever had a faulty motor either from Fallhaber or from Citizen. So been very reliable.
So you don't get many returns then?
No, thankfully not.
Nice to hear. Anybody else got some questions for Lee? doesn't appear so at the moment. Anything you want to? We're getting towards the end of our session. We've got theoretically another 10 minutes to go. But Lee, any other things you'd like to say, really?
Well, there's a question. Do you fit stay alive? Yeah, on the smaller engines for DCC we do, and it does make a big difference. On the larger engines, the large ESU decoders already have capacitors, basically stay alive as part of the decoder. But yeah, definitely if you're doing small wheelbase engines, fitting a stay alive, which is a little capacitor, basically makes a tremendous difference in the running of the models. I mean, it's a business now that next year I'm retiring from for many different reasons, but it certainly wasn't made any easier with the pandemic. In Korea, things are changing rapidly. The cost of living in Korea has gone up so much that it's becoming really expensive to have the models made. So a lot of companies, and I think in particular the German companies, are moving now to China. And the Chinese have been doing some subcontracting work for the Koreans for a number of years now, castings and etchings and this kind of stuff. And they've really upped their game as well. So we're kind of coming back to how it was when the production moved from Japan to Korea, and it's now moving from Korea to China. I'm not quite sure where the future of brass models lie. I think if they're going to continue, it'll have to continue in China so they're affordable, because you obviously can't keep upping the price in the market. You just won't sell any. It would be fantastic, as I mentioned before, if you could make, say, 40 of a particular prototype. Then you could do many more interesting prototypes, but it's down to the commercial side of it again. So yeah, it's been around for a long time, as this particular business. And I was in Japan a few years ago and went to show and met some of the old builders, the Japanese builders, and the work was just phenomenal. And it still boggles the mind, really, how these people several thousand miles away who don't know a 517 from an aircraft basically can just take this information and sit down and make these models to the standard that they do. There's no fancy RSU soldering units used. They're really really old-fashioned soldering irons, which they hold in a sort of dagger way, kind of like this, and solder. You know, I expected all this amazing fancy equipment, and it's all pretty basic. The pattern makers as well have the most basic equipment: a pantograph milling machine, a little watchmaker's lathe, maybe a couple of other small machines, and they're able to churn these beautifully detailed silver soldered patterns out at an incredible rate. That's slowly changing as 3D drawing is taking over. People are now starting to use 3D patterns. And that helps price-wise, I guess, in the production of things. But it's been quite a hard push to get them to change to 3D drawing and 3D printing and this kind of stuff over the years. Chris,
a couple more questions.
Sure.
Progress on the standard 4 tank.
Yeah, well, that's, I mean, yeah. This is always the great thing. The builders tell you, oh, next week, and it's always next week, and you have to ask which year they mean. These days, in the past, we would have had multiple projects overlapping each other. Now, since the pandemic and all the problems that caused, it's now one project at a time. The reason as well the builders quite like to have multiple projects is because you're then basically paying multiple project money, which is great, because in the history of brass trains in the early days, what would happen is you would commission a builder you would have a promissory note with your bank, and they would build the entire project. You would inspect it and then pay for it. It then went to 4 payments across the project. And then as things got more difficult, it became monthly payments, which is very difficult for the importer. That's quite hard going. And often you can end up in a difficult position where you are paying in advance of the work. So that can be a little bit difficult. So now my preference for the guys that I'm working with is do one project, finish it, and do the next project. So the one I'm working on now with the new chap in China is the 850 project, and then the standard tank is after that. So once the 850 project's in production, we get on with the design and the pilot sample of the standard tank. Another question there. I thought of carrying on, but with plastic and die cast. Only possibly doing that as a consultant. I think I've kind of had enough of the travel. As somebody asked earlier, sorry, I would normally go to Korea 4 or 5 times a year if there was problems with a project. I think I found myself one time in August before Gildex being there twice in 1 month. And that gets a bit wearing. It was very, very exciting to begin with, doing these long flights, but not any longer. So I'm actually at the moment giving a little bit of assistance to Richard Webster, just on research side of things. I think Dapol would quite like to do the 517, but as a die-cast plastic model. So I'm giving him a little bit of assistance. We'll see if that happens as a project. But no, I'm changing and going back to just being a model maker again, and also looking at doing commercial modeling work, not just trains, but other work as well. So
a bit of a change for you. Sounds
yeah. Well, as I say, by next year, by the time I finish next year, that'll be 14 years of doing this, and it's also down to sort of choice of prototype. I mean, I really do think that the plastic die-cast models that are coming out, I think these are fantastic. I'm not a snob about this at all. I think they're really, really good. And I had a chance to look at some of Dapol's models at Stafford this year. And it's fantastic for the money. I mean, it's just not possible to do anything like that in brass, because the brass models are handmade. There are people just sitting there for, from 8 o'clock in the morning to 6 o'clock at night, soldering parts together, and it's just not a process that you can speed up. So I think for the future, and I think it's fantastic for O-Gauge. Ellis and Dapol and stuff that these guys are doing, and you notice a lot of the German companies are doing this as well now. They mix die cast and brass, and so I think that's the way forward. And when I was in China, I saw some beautiful die cast samples of German Gauge 1 diesels with all the detail, and it was just phenomenally good. The only thing with that is the numbers. You have to sell a lot of them because it's obviously not cheap to make the die-cast molds. So, best of luck to these guys. I think it's brilliant for the hobby.
Yeah. Well, I think we're pretty much at the end of our hour that we've allotted. I'd like to say a huge thank you to Lee for giving us a very entertaining.
Hopefully I've not babbled on too much.
No, it's extremely interesting, certainly for me, and I hope it was for everybody else. So
thanks for those who made it. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, getting quite a few thank yous coming through. So once again, I will close the session now and let you all get back to different aspects of the virtual show.
Well, thanks very much. Thanks very much, James, Peter. Thank you. And he kept quiet the entire time.
Well done, Roo. You did really well.
Thanks again. Thanks, everybody.
Right.
Bye.
Bye-bye.